way around the north shore of Lake Superior as the sun rises to its highest point in the sky. It's rained on me for several days, so this is a nice relief from the weather. Hunger hits and I decide that the next turnout I find, I'll look for lunch. I randomly pick a town that's a quick detour to my south by the name of Rossport. Keeping with the theme of random, the name of the cafe is, coincidentally, Serendipity Gardens Cafe and Guest House. It's actually a beautiful place to stop. Rossport is posted up on the north shore of Lake Superior, obscured from the open lake by a series of islands that protect the town from being thrashed by the waves of the lake's interior. It makes it one of the most protected harbors on Lake Superior, a lake known for its extreme weather. The calming effect the islands have on the waters here make it a great spot for kayaking and canoeing, which many visitors do to explore the islands themselves. Rossport has a quaint, permanent population of 65 people. Because the waters outside of Rossport are deep and protected by the islands to the south, and because Rossport was picked to be an overnight stop on the Canadian Pacific Railway line, Rossport became a successful, bustling commercial fishing village. Then, during the 1930s, a small fishing competition morphed into an international event. The Rossport Fish Derby was held annually here through the 40s and 50s, as thousands of fishermen would compete to see who could catch the biggest lake trout. Tragically, the trout population of Lake Superior plummeted. It wasn't the result of overfishing. A non-native species had invaded Lake Superior and devastated the local fish stocks. The lamprey eel had been introduced to Lake Superior for the first time. How did it get here? Almost 900 kilometers away, or almost 1,300 kilometers downstream through the Great Lakes system, a canal was built between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie to bypass the Niagara Falls. Lake Erie is much higher up than Lake Ontario, as you can see by this diagram or by looking at the falls themselves. The United States and Canada have a long history of taking advantage of the geography of the Great Lakes to assist in shipping. Like a mini Mediterranean, many cities popped up around the Great Lakes because it had one major economic upside. Shipping is cheap, and transporting goods over water is fast. The only problem is this big difference in altitude from Lake Erie to Ontario. It's like all the other lakes are up on a shelf. How do you get ships to go uphill? The answer is canals. The Erie and Welland canals were two major infrastructure projects that brought shipping to the rest of the Great Lakes for the first time in the early 19th century. The Erie Canal connected the Hudson River and New York City to Lake Erie through the Mohawk Valley that conveniently cut through the Catskill Mountains. The completion of the canal turned New York City into a major economic powerhouse, quite literally laying down the groundwork that brought about the economic conditions that turned it into one of the major cities of the world. Today, the Erie Canal is mostly used for recreational traffic, but it still sees a good amount of cargo. The Welland Canal was on the Canadian side of the Niagara Falls and is now the main route for shipping in the Great Lakes. It's because of this canal that Duluth, Minnesota, deep within the North American continent, is still an international port. More than likely unknown to the people of the time, there was a problem with artificially opening up the upper Great Lakes to the ocean like this. Unnaturally connecting Lake Erie with the sea was bound to open a door to some uninvited guests. Enter the sea lamprey. Over the course of a century and a half, the lamprey eel slowly made its way through the Great Lakes system, wreaking havoc on the unsuspecting fish population. Lampreys themselves are pretty nasty-looking creatures. They're a parasitic species of eel-like fish, but they're not eels. They have no jaw, no true teeth, or no paired fins. They spawn in rivers and can spend 8 to 10 years as larvae before turning into adults, which is probably why it may have taken so long for them to invade so far north. When adults, they feed off of unsuspecting fish. The fish of the Great Lakes region do not recognize lampreys as predators, so it's very easy for them to swim right up to them and attach to them with their sucker-like mouths. Their tongue actually rasps a hole in the prey fish's body, and the lamprey remains attached to the fish to feed off their blood and nutrients until it kills them. Studies in captivity have shown that lamprey can kill almost 20 pounds of fish during their adult life cycle. They could double that in the wild. From the 1930s to 1950s, just as the Rossport fishing derby was at its peak, we saw a major decline in the multi-million-dollar fishing industry of Lake Superior. The red line shows how many thousand metric tons of fish were harvested out of Lake Superior, and the blue line shows how many tens of thousands of lamprey were caught in electrical and mechanical weirs around Lake Superior. The orange line is the time of the first Rossport fish derby. Rossport aside, you can see how the number of harvested fish from Lake Superior stayed steady until a lamprey population boom devastated the industry. You can see, however, the US and Canada recognized the threat and decided to retaliate. So what are we doing about this now? The lamprey is an ever-present threat to the fishing economies of the Great Lakes, and the US and Canadian governments are fighting back. The US has the Fish and Wildlife Service, and Canada has the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. These two federal agencies, alongside many state, provincial, and nonprofit organizations, are engaged in a war of attrition against the invasive lamprey menace. For decades, they've taken the battle to the streams and lakes that feed into the Laurentian watershed, spraying a lampricide known as TFM. It was a chemical compound invented over the course of the 50s and 60s by the US Fish and Wildlife Service with the intent of specifically targeting lampreys without harming other plants or animals while having no long-term impacts on the ecosystem. Lamprey typically grow up, live, and mate in more gentle streams, so agents of these organizations ruck into the woods with all their equipment to drop TFM into streams, both large and small. It's a huge effort. They typically cycle visits to the same streams every 3 to 4 years. Other strategies, such as introducing sterile males into the environment, are being developed with the goal of reducing their numbers even further. The US spends about $14 million, and Canada spends about $7 million annually on lamprey control. As of the most recent report, as this video was made, 3 out of 5 of the Great Lakes are hitting their targets. As you can tell, this isn't an easy battle. If it wasn't for the taxpayer effort to fund these agencies, fish stocks would plummet along with many other private industries that rely on them. Luckily, numbers are near historic lows now, but a 1-year lapse in funding will cause a major rebound that could destroy native fish populations once again.